Tonight we continue a series of interviews with candidates running at large for Boston City Council. Our guest is a first-time candidate from Jamaica Plain. We'd like to welcome Sean Ryan. Thank you very much for being with us, Sean.
Thanks, Chris.
Tell me a little bit about your background.
Well, I'm 28 years old. I grew up in Jamaica Plain. I was born in 1980, and I went to the Boston Public Schools starting in K-1, and I continued in the Boston Public Schools all throughout my pre-college education. I went to the Trotter School, and then to the Hennigan School, and then to the King School, and then to Boston Latin School. I went to Harvard immediately after high school, and there I majored in music. I got a Bachelor of Arts in music. They don't have a performance degree there, but I'm a pianist. I continued playing the piano, and I also took up conducting while I was at Harvard. I graduated from Harvard, and then I spent 3 years out of school, during which time I was working several different jobs. I worked as a water meter installer. I worked as a church organist. I worked as an office assistant. I worked at Fenway Park selling hot dogs, which is what I still do. And I also worked as a pedicab driver. And I was saving up money to be able to afford grad school. I also spent some time with my family because my father was diagnosed with cancer, and he passed away in '06, right before I went to Cleveland to go get my master's degree in orchestral conducting.
So hard to match the diversity of that experience, but some viewers might be thinking, what does that have to do with being a city councilor?
Well, that's a good question. My interest in politics stems from my interest in economics. And I realize that we don't have all day, so I'll just try and sum it up very quickly. But starting in around 2001, probably after 9/11, I started thinking a little bit more about geopolitical issues, and that led me to an interest in politics. I followed the presidential election this past 2 years or so, and at that point I became turned on to the issue of monetary policy, and that led to a lot of research on my part into economics.
Now, most of us think monetary policy, that's what banks charge for interest rates.
Well, that's a small part of it. I mean, monetary policy in our country begins with the Federal Reserve, which is our nation's central bank. We don't actually use real money anymore in this country. We have socialized money. So the government controls our money supply, and we use the pieces of paper that they give us. And the central bank has the power to manipulate interest rates, which has very far-reaching effects on the economy. Like, for example, if you're wondering why we're going into a depression right now, you have to look at the money supply and what the Federal Reserve has done. And you can do this throughout the 20th century. Since the Federal Reserve's inception, you can see how they've affected economic realities for your everyday citizen.
Well, no doubt monetary policy is very important, but what can you do about it that's important if you're a member of the city council?
Well, there's not that much that we can do directly, but monetary policy sort of leads you to other principal positions on other issues as well, because what it basically comes down to is that we each have a right to our life, liberty, and property. And when you realize what the government has done in one of the facets of our existence to interfere with that, it turns you on to some of the other ways in which government basically runs our life to a greater or lesser extent. So I'm not focusing on monetary policy in my political run here in Boston, because clearly that's not what most people are concerned about at this time. So I'm trying to bring a similar philosophy, a philosophy of freedom, to some of the more local issues.
Well, give me an example how you do that to prevent us from going down that road to serfdom.
Well, I think we can take a look at government schools as one example of how government affects us on a local basis. One issue that some people are concerned about is neighborhood schools, and also the prospect of more or fewer or the same number of charter schools. One thing that government schools does is it affects our ability to hold our children's educators accountable for their results. Say that you have a government-sponsored monopoly on, I don't know, cell phones or shoes. If the government has this humongous market share and can dictate the conditions, you have a very hard time holding them accountable. because you can't withdraw your payment for those services. So to the extent that government schools are involuntary, in that your money is taken from you whether you want it or not, that gives you less control as an individual. So charter schools, in a certain way, help to mitigate that by just adding an element of competition into the school system. So now, even though the government is still taking your money, if a charter school comes along and can spend that same amount of money better, then if we have more of them and if you can somehow get your kid into one of them, then your kid may have a better shot at a better quality education. And to take that principle a little further, this is where the idea comes for the school vouchers. Now, I know that that term may have a Republican ring to it to a lot of people, and it certainly did to me before I started trying to think these issues through according to principles. And so essentially I think that we could really improve performance if, even if you think that the government needs to be involved in the allocation of funds for students, if you think that the government has a redistributive role to play in education, and that each student should have the same amount of money spent on their education regardless of their parents' economic background, that doesn't mean that the government should have to tell you where you spend it.
Yeah, this is timely because just this afternoon, Mayor Menino said he'd go along with creating charter schools, not the same charter schools, but charters within the Boston School District. And if you can't do that with a change through legislation, he'd go along with lifting the cap on charters. Is that something that you'd more or less go along with?
I don't think there should be any cap. I don't think there should be any law that restricts the amount of competition in society, as long as competition is fair and honest. And I don't think that a system in which you are forced to give your money is fair and honest. I think that if you're running, a school that's great, people will want to pay voluntarily for that service. That's my belief.